G'day. Today is Pentecost Sunday, the 19th of May, 2024. I just want to read a few words from Acts chapter 2. You might remember that when the day of Pentecost fully came, the disciples, as it says in the Bible, they were all together in one place. Suddenly a sound like the blowing of a violent wind came from heaven and filled the whole house where they were sitting. They saw what seemed to be tongues of fire that separated and came to rest on each of them. All of them were filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit enabled them. Now you might remember that at that time there were many Jews in Jerusalem that were there for the Pentecost celebration, and they were startled because although they came from different places and spoke different languages, they were hearing the disciples praising God in their own languages, and they wondered what was going on. Some of them said that these men are drunk. So it says, this is in verse 14, Peter stood up with the 11, raised his voice and addressed the crowd. Fellow Jews, and all of you who live in Jerusalem, let me explain this to you. Listen carefully to what I say. These people are not drunk as you suppose. It's only 9 a.m. No, this is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. In the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people. Your sons and daughters will prophesy. Your young men will see visions. Your old men will dream dreams. Even on my servants, both men and women, I will pour out my spirit in those days, and they will prophesy. And then he goes on and talks about how those who call on the name will be saved. Now, one of the things that I think we really tend to forget about Pentecost is what a radical plan it expresses for the people of God. Up until the time of Jesus, up until Pentecost really, the emphasis was on keeping the rules, on being the sort of people who know their place in society, who fit in their place, who do what is required of them in that situation, and don't ask too many questions. And now here we have the day of Pentecost, and suddenly Peter is expressing a completely different view of what it is to be God's people. And it's a view which comes really from the Old Testament, from scriptures that the Jewish people should have known because they would have read it regularly in their synagogues. But Peter is saying the time that Joel, the prophet Joel, said was going to come has now arrived, and it starts everything out differently. So the difference is that God has poured out his Spirit on all people. And that's something that we need to take very seriously in our own lives. One of the indications he gives us here is not speaking in tongues, which has become a sort of fairly popular indicator of the work of the Holy Spirit, but rather it's about prophecy. He says both sons and daughters will prophesy. So it's not just that the Spirit is poured out on all, but that it's very clear that this is both men and women. So it was common to think in those days that God really worked with the men and the women were sort of secondary. But here he's saying, I will pour out my Spirit on all people. And just so you get it clear, that means both men and women. Then he goes on, and it's about the end of age-related distinctions. So it's not common to think of young people as really not having much to contribute. You had to have life experience. You had to have been around a bit. When you were 30 or so, you were sufficiently mature to know what was going on in the world. But here he says, your young men will see visions and your old men will dream dreams. So visions and dreams were ways that it was expected that God would communicate with people, particularly people who were really listening for God to speak. And here he's saying that it's not a matter of how old you are, it's a matter of whether the Spirit is on you. And then the third thing is he talks about the distinction between slave and free, and at the bottom of the social pile, as far as most people in those days were concerned, were slave girls. They had no rights. They were virtually chattels. Male slaves often had certain rights, certain responsibilities, were treated as an important part of the household, even though they couldn't necessarily leave. But slave girls they were there to do the work, to be available to the master if he wanted her. They didn't have any real place in society. And here Peter is saying that the day has now come that the Spirit is poured out even on servants, on slaves. The word that's used there is the word for slave. So it's a breaking down of all the social niceties of the world that they lived in. And Peter is saying that these conditions have now arisen. And what I want us to think about in relation to this is that we have a tendency in our society to still make those sorts of divisions. And even in churches, we still make those sorts of divisions. I remember I was part of a church many years ago where they didn't want to have a pastor who was under 45 because they thought around about that age he would be sufficiently mature. And I'm sure we missed out on a lot of very good potential pastors just because they had to have someone who was an older man, and they got an older man, and he wasn't really much of a pastor, I've got to say. There were things he did do very well, but pastoring was not his forte. I know people, even Christians, who don't want to hear from women, even though here we have the assurance that the Spirit is poured out on all. The Spirit is poured out on both sons and daughters. The Spirit is poured out even on slaves, both men and women. So surely if the Spirit is given, and it's a spirit of prophecy, a spirit of being able to communicate God's messages, then we should be able to hear from women. I saw something the other day. A woman had been campaigning for protections for women and wanted to speak in a church service on one occasion fairly recently, and she set out to the pastor what she wanted to talk about. She just asked that she could have the pulpit one Sunday and talk about a Christian response to the abuse of women. And the pastor said, I'll never have a woman preach in my pulpit. And how ridiculous that is when, if there's anyone who knows what abuse of women is about, it's a woman. So we live in a world where we know about Pentecost, but we're not really living Pentecost. And I think we should have another think about what the Bible is really saying to us. If the Spirit has truly been given to us, then we need to live according to the Spirit and not according to man-made rules that are designed merely to control what people do, to prevent people from being responsive to the Spirit. So I want to encourage us to take the opportunity this Pentecost Sunday to look at our lives, look at our attitudes, and allow the Spirit of God to transform us through the renewing of our minds. And may that happen, and may it be a blessing to us and to our churches.